So I want to formally introduce Al Cross, who is our director of the Institute for Rural Journalism and Community Issues. He started that institute in 2004 when he joined the college. Before that, he worked for 26 years at the Courier-Journal, where he was a member of the Pulitzer Prize winning team in 1989 for the work that they did on the deadly school bus crash, and also is a member of our Journalism Hall of Fame, has been recognized with the Kentucky Journalism Hall of Fame, and also was the national president of SPJ, which I just learned by looking at your bio today, Al, and I don't know how I missed that, but 2001 to 2002, he was the National Society of Professional Journalists president. And so we are so thrilled that we've got Al in our college. You will see Al and hear Al and read Al, pretty much anything that's talking about Kentucky politics. He is the voice, the go-to person that everybody, will come get a great soundbite, because you do give good sound bites, Al. I will give you that. As part of the Institute for Rural Journalism and Community Issues, they published the Rural Blog and the Kentucky Health News, and then he also does work with the Midway Messenger and with our journalism students. We've got work through that. So if you guys are not following the irjci blogspot.com, that's a great place to get news from all around Kentucky and issues with rural journalism, and the Kentucky Health News is a great digest as well. I probably get about 70% of my Kentucky news from what is being produced here in our college, and we're really proud to have Al on our faculty. And thank you, Catherine, for dropping that in there. So our topic tonight is misinformation and disinformation, and we're going to talk really about that in a political context, but obviously there's all sorts of ways that this has permeated our society. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and then I want to open it up for you guys to either unmute and ask questions, or you can drop questions in the chat for our speaker. So the first thing that I'm going to ask Al is how you define misinformation or disinformation. What does that mean?
I would say that disinformation is purposeful misinformation. If somebody is trying to misinform you, they are disinforming you.
So how do you define then disinformation is purposeful misinformation, or did I just get that backwards? Okay.
Yeah, so disinformation is purposeful misinformation.
Okay, so how would you define misinformation? Just wrong stuff?
Yeah, incorrect stuff. Assertions of fact, even opinions that are non-supported or off base. And we're awash in misinformation these days. We live in a completely new information environment, which is being manipulated by dark forces, to be frank about it. And the old filtering function of mass communicators like me and our paymasters, my past paymasters, has largely evaporated because everybody can have their say on social media. And unfortunately, the more outrageous it is, the more likely it is to be shared, at least among certain people. And we could talk for an hour about how the problem came about, but I usually find it's better to talk about some specific examples, and that's where you folks come in if you want to ask about particular things that are going on in Kentucky or the nation or the world.
So you say that we're awash in misinformation right now. And so just diving a little bit into how this came about, what percentage can we assign to social media as part of that? I mean, or was this happening before we had rapid dissemination where everybody's a publisher?
It was happening before social media. I'll try to do a 5-minute history lesson. It begins with a feeling by conservatives in the 1950s that mass media, the Eastern liberal media establishment, was not reflecting their points of view. And this was gradually embraced by the Nixon administration. Spiro Agnew, the vice president, talked about the nattering nabobs of negativism. And it became an article of faith among conservatives that their views were not properly reflected in the mass media. Now, they had a point. There was and is an Eastern liberal media establishment, but it is not as liberal as anybody would have you believe. It leaned left, and sometimes it didn't correct itself when it needed to. I think it does that today, but the cow's out of the barn, so to speak. The advent of cable news was the beginning of the end. CNN got started, and then Fox News started as essentially what Roger Ailes thought would be an antidote or to CNN or a promoter of conservative causes. And now we've seen MSNBC arise as a liberal alternative to that. During the Trump administration, I'm afraid that CNN has become more anti-Trump than it needs to be. Donald Trump is a guy who sort of makes you take sides, and they've taken sides, unfortunately. We live in an environment today because of this fractionalized environment, so many sources of information, that if you want information that confirms what you already believe, it's out there. If you want contrary information, it's out there, but you're unlikely to go after it because that's just human nature. We seek out facts and opinions that support what we already think. And that puts us in echo chambers, bubbles, whatever. We do not converse as much with people who have opposing views as we used to. I try to keep a pretty varied Facebook page with lots of conservatives, liberals on it. And unfortunately, the conversations usually devolve into name calling and assertions that can't be supported. But at least I'm staying in tune with people who are reflecting both ends of the spectrum.
So you brought us from through the advent of cable news and the 24/7 news cycle, all the way to social media, but you're talking about your personal social media page and, the interactions that you may have with actual real people who have opinions. What about the industries that have built up around social media algorithms with the idea of spreading false information? Because one statistic that's widely cited is that false news will spread 7 times more rapidly than the truth in this environment. And you've got people with companies that are actually writing on both sides of the political spectrum just to get clicks. And so that's an economically motivated one. But then there's also the whole industries that are built up both domestically and foreign to disrupt our democracies through the social media platforms. How much of a problem is that? I mean, so is the problem just us disagreeing with each other as real people, or this broader issue?
No, if you read the Mueller report and if you read the Senate Intelligence Committee report, you know that the Russians are trying to make us disunited. They're trying to make us disagree. They're trying to sow division. They're trying to sow doubt about our democracy. As General Kelly, the president's former chief of staff, said in a speech to the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, the Russians decided who they wanted to win the election, and they did a good job of it. And now they are doing Lord knows what. Luckily, we still have people in the intelligence community who are willing to blow the whistle on that. And I'm reasonably confident that we can get through this election without any great damage being done, but we're at a considerable risk. And the thing that worries me the most is we don't know how much risk we're at. It's the people in the intelligence services who really know what's going on, and they can't reveal everything because that would reveal sources and methods. We'll know more after the election, I think.
So we're in an environment, so we talked a little bit about social media, and then this is going to be my last question, so I want you guys to be prepared to ask questions. But we're in an environment where basically we've come to a situation where we don't really trust anybody. So, you know, like the Republicans are not going to trust the Democrats don't trust the Republicans, people don't trust the mainstream media. And so, you know, what are the long-term implications of a society where people just don't know where to get information they can trust?
It is a fairly dark prospect. You know, my email signature is a quote from James Madison, which says to the effect, unless people in a democracy have popular information, meaning readily available information, then it's a prelude to a farce or something else or worse. I think what we need are political leaders who will stop trying to abuse the system. And we need people within the media environment, in the media companies, who will stand up to this abuse. There was a really good column today by Margaret Sullivan in the Washington Post, which talked about the misinformation that the president spreads about voting and elections. And there was some good research that showed it was spread primarily by mainstream media. They worries about it, you know, trying to play the quote fair and balanced role. But they're not doing enough gatekeeping, not doing enough filtering. You know, just because the president says something doesn't mean you ought to make a big story out of it. If he says something that's false, then I think you don't report that quite as much. The problem is with cable news trying to fill up 24 hours a day and people hungry for information. Every little bit of information that comes out of the White House is news, and it really shouldn't be that much news. There ought to be some gradation. There ought to be some judgment made about it. But with all these cable news outfits and competition, plus other outlets in competition, it's probably unreasonable for us to expect that. You know, if they started to do that, they'd get accused of engaging in a media conspiracy. When in fact they would be simply exercising good judgment, the kind of judgment that they used to exercise when the market was not so competitive. It's easy, ethical when your business is not on the line.
Well, it's interesting to listen to NPR. Even in the past 2 to 3 years, there's been a complete shift in the way that they will report stories, and that they say President Trump asserted today, comma, without any evidence whatsoever to back him up, and then they say what he asserted. They put that right in the sentence before they even give the assertion, but they still report the assertion. It is a very
I think you still have to report it, but you know, maybe you don't put it in every hour of the newscast.
Okay, what questions do you guys have? We've got folks that are here because we love to talk about journalism. What questions do you guys have? You can, if you want to just unmute, I think we're a small enough group, just unmute and ask your question.
And we can talk about the newspaper business and what the future of it is. We talk about other forms of media. Talk about some of the stuff I do. You know, I have an online, largely online newspaper for Midway that my students and I do. We try to put out health information through Kentucky Health News for Kentucky media. And that has become almost a full-time job during the pandemic. And the Rural Blog is a national publication which gives events, ideas, trends, and journalism from and about rural America every day.
And that's got, what, about 26 partners, right? Partner universities and... Well,
they're academic partners of the Institute for Rural Journalism. And, you know, we don't have memberships and we don't have contracts. So we just...
Right, but it partners that...
It's a bunch of people who agree to help each other out when we can. And it's, I wouldn't say a very active group, but we have some people who have been very helpful to us.
Okay. Nancy, you had a question?
Yeah, Al, I would love to hear your thinking on the future of newspapers, especially local newspapers, and if anything can be done to save them, because as I understand the situation, it is quite dire that newspapers are purchased and then shut down because they're not making a profit. And our democracy is dying because of that. So
yeah,
what
there
are
are
your
newspapers
thoughts?
that have newspapers that have been closed because they weren't making enough profit. You know, there's a great graphic available from the Center for the Study of the American West at Stanford University. And the graphic shows every newspaper in the United States from the 1600s to today. And it shows that we peaked at 17,000 newspapers in 1909. And that was before the advent of radio, long before the advent of television. And as other media came along and as the country became more urbanized, we lost thousands of newspapers in rural America. We lost a lot of them in metro America too. You know, New York used to have 7 daily newspapers. That loss of newspapers has accelerated in the last 15 years for 2 or 3 reasons. One, the digital competition. The advertising-based model for newspapers has been effectively destroyed. You had a recession that hit newspapers in the head, and now we have a pandemic that has led directly to the closure of newspapers in this state, in Moorhead, Monticello, and Greenup, for example, Community Newspaper Holdings Incorporated. So we still have about 6,500 paid circulation newspapers in this country. But if you look at the annual circulation reports, which are coming out in the papers this week on the regular schedule, you see a significant drop in circulation. The numbers to look at in these fine print reports in your newspaper are the total paid circulation for the issue published closest to the filing date and the average number for the year. And I'm seeing differences of 10, 20, even 30% between the average for the year and the number published closest to the filing date. And, you know, when you start losing advertising, you lose circulation, and it's a deadly spiral. Newspapers have known for a long time that they're going to have to get most of their revenue from the audience, and that the audience will be less, that the household penetration of newspapers is probably going to be no more than 20 or 25% at the best. They used to enjoy penetration of 50 to 60%, some greater. Newspapers are still the primary fact finders in society and probably will be. And I think people are coming to realize that that is something worth supporting through big subscription prices. You know, it costs you $1,300 a year to subscribe to the Herald Leader these days, and donations. A number of newspapers have run sort of like GoFundMe drives to say, look, we've got a newsroom of 4 people. We're going to have 2 or 3 if we don't get more support. And there have been some newspapers that have been rather successful at that. Others not so successful. I think that the key to their future is quality. You know, people are not going to pay big money for a newspaper that isn't worth much. The newspaper that I used to edit, the Grayson County News Gazette in Litchfield, Kentucky, put out its circulation report this last week, and they had a circulation of less than 1,000. When I edited that newspaper, our circulation was 4,500. And that newspaper is not long for this world. There is another newspaper in that town, which is owned by a chain, and actually does a pretty good job because it's owned by Landmark Community Newspapers. Chains can be helpful in that they can insulate local newspapers from deleterious influences, but they can also be bad. You know, I used to think CNHI was one of the better chains, but I think they made some rather bad decisions in closing those newspapers in Monticello and Greenup and Moorhead. So back to your question, Nancy, the future is rather uncertain. And I think it's fair to say that printed newspapers are going to be much rarer birds in about 10 years. You know, the audience for print is gradually dying off. People who are over 50 are the print readers, and people who are under 50 are not. And that is not going to change. So I think there is a way for newspapers to adapt and go online and get support from the audience and some advertising. But the old rule of thumb is going to be turned around. You know, the old rule of thumb used to be you got 75% of your revenue from advertising and 25% from circulation. And now it's probably going to be 25% from advertising and 75% from your audience. And that means you'll have a smaller audience. But to be frank about it, the people who matter in a community, the people who care about public affairs, are the people who are going to subscribe to a newspaper or support a newspaper. And I think our democracy, both locally and at the state and national levels, can maintain itself at that kind of level. If we have a good 25% of the people who will subscribe to the main fact finders, to the newspapers, and then have those facts repeated by other media, we'll still have a reasonably informed population. But it's not going to be quite as healthy a democracy as it was 20 years ago.
The other exacerbating issue is when you had, you know, we used to talk about the concern about chain ownership, but it's basically these hedge funds that had nothing to do with media bought local newspapers to bleed them dry and did not care about the community. And that's, you know, then they didn't care about quality.
Different kinds of chains. You know, the first newspaper chains had newspaper DNA in them. These were newspaper people who formed groups and, you know, went to the stock market and got capital and grew their companies. It was a pretty good business proposition. But now we have these chains that are in it just to bleed the cash flow and to make, you know, a quarter. And these are the kinds of chains that are closing newspapers in county seat towns. I went back to that graphic from Stanford. You look closely, you would see that most county seats still had or have a newspaper. There's only about 200 counties out of 3,100 in the country that don't have a local newspaper. And most of the ones we've lost in the last 20 to 40 years were outside county seats because the town just shriveled up and didn't have enough base for a newspaper, or they were suburban community newspapers. That's really the plurality of the papers that have closed in the last 20 years. But now when you see county seat newspapers closing, that is an alarm bell. You know, I used to edit a newspaper in Monticello back in the 1970s. I always say we were a second newspaper in a one newspaper town, and I didn't last very long because there was an established local newspaper. Well, it wound up selling to a chain, and that chain closed it a few months ago, largely because these chains operate these newspapers as clusters. They wanted to save the Somerset Daily because the Monticello Weekly was weighing it down. And I think the same thing happened in Moorhead. It's part of the Ashland cluster, and it was doing badly on its balance sheet because of Moorhead. So they just effectively did away with Moorhead. You know, they tried to have the fig leaf of an online site, but I told them when they did that, that was not going to work, and it is not working. Now, luckily, Moorhead has gotten another paper. Somebody moved in from the next county and started a paper, and it shows there is still a demand for local newspapers. They are one form of identity, one form of pride, one form of cohesiveness for a community. And if you run them the right way, they'll still survive. But you have to be smarter and more nimble than ever, and you have to be able to adapt.
What other questions do we have? Kenzie, you've got your hand raised, and then Ron, you'll be next. Kenzie, do you want to unmute?
Hi. With our generation, like springing more and more into the future and into technology, do you believe that that could play a big part in misinformation and disinformation, since we readily have technology at our hands at all times?
Absolutely. It's an open door to information, but it's harder to evaluate the sources. The old saying, consider the source, is all the more important today. You see something shared by a friend and you may take it as gospel or, put considerable credence to it, but it might actually be a fake story, or it might be a rather opinionated story that doesn't really give the facts. Our attention span is too short these days. We don't take time to look behind these social media posts and see what's going on. I think it's helpful for any of us in the communications business to have an elevator speech for people. And that elevator speech is this: news media pay for journalism, which practices a discipline of verification. We tell you how we know something, or we quote somebody as saying so. And we're mainly about fact, not so much about opinion. Social media are more about opinion than fact and have no discipline and no verification. They are simply not to be trusted. If people would get that message, we'd have a better democracy.
I'm glad that was recorded. That was profound. That was great. Dr. Wing, you are up.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Al. This is really helpful. My question is kind of just to ask, have you seen any interesting movement in the battle against like misinformation, disinformation? Oftentimes we hear a lot of emphasis placed on, platforms such as Twitter, Facebook. They've recently taken down some of Trump's tweets and postings because they're, not true. But have you seen any like technology or education kind of effort that are promising in this fight?
Well, I don't keep as close a track of that as I should. I have many irons in the fire. I will say that I've been pleased and surprisingly so at some of the efforts that Facebook and Twitter have made in recent weeks.
Yeah.
And it was really helpful for Facebook to announce yesterday that it was going to block political posts after the election because we do have the possibility of civil unrest fostered by people who want you to believe that the election is over, the election was fraudulent or whatever. These platforms have been very reluctant to play any sort of editing role because they operate under the exemption in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1996 that says, they're just platforms. They're not publishers. Well, they are in fact publishers in almost any sense of the word we've ever used. But they are a new breed of cat, and the laws have not quite caught up to them. They are trying to stay ahead of the laws, frankly. And the next Congress may take another look at exactly how they're allowed to operate. I don't think we're going to have any real challenge to the availability of information in this country, but I think there's going to be some serious questions raised about the responsibility of disseminating that information, that you need to be accountable for the ramifications that stem from it. I think that's probably what Mark Zuckerberg was thinking about when he made that announcement yesterday. He does not want to be blamed for riots in the streets after the election.
Well, and then the question is, are they the right people to be policing? Zuckerberg's argument is we'll police ourselves. Just trust us to take care of it, and we will. So
yeah, I don't know who should police it,
about
frankly.
that.
If you subscribe, if you're a First Amendment absolutist, then you have to say nobody polices it. That the only solution to bad speech is better speech or more speech. That formula doesn't quite work in the media environment that we're operating in. I think the key is more education of the public, understand the difference in fact and opinion, the difference in social media and news media. They could also learn something about strategic media, which use both the other kind and sometimes masquerade as news media. But I don't know how you effectively do that. It's a challenge for the country at large, and I would hope that the next round of political leaders would do something about it.
Sorry, Taylor, I think you're up next.
Yeah, sure. This question is sort of a piggyback off of Kenzie's question, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, Al, on back in the spring when, well, I guess it was June, when Kentucky had the primary election. There was a lot circulating that Louisville was practicing in voter suppression by having fewer precincts. And Career Journal reporter Joe Sonka and all the local media was trying to put out as much content as possible saying, no, Kentuckians have had way more opportunities to vote. And I don't know, I saw it all on my social media, people who are from California or New York or Florida just perpetuating that misinformation, and it just simply wasn't true.
Well, some celebrities picked up on that misinformation and shared it. And that's what really drove the opinion. You know, people who had millions of Twitter followers can circulate a lot of misinformation. It goes back to what Mark Twain said 150 years ago: a lie can make its way all around the world before the truth can get its pants on. In fact, there was no voter suppression in Jefferson County, Kentucky. And my authority on that is Raoul Cunningham, the president of the NAACP chapter. Yeah, sure, they just had one big voting place, but they had free buses to it, and they had plenty of absentee votes out there. They had people actively drumming up votes for Charles Booker and Amy McGrath. And the only real problem we had with voter suppression was long lines in Fayette County because they didn't have enough voting precincts. And the Secretary of State held Fayette County's feet to the fire this week. He said, I'm not going to approve your plan unless you have more voting places. He said Fayette was the only place that really had a problem. So I think we can be happy in this state that we have a Secretary of State who knows the election laws and is he's the first election lawyer we've ever had as Secretary of State. And he's enforcing them, implementing them in a bipartisan way with the cooperation of the governor. And people in Kentucky have really no worries about the integrity of our voting system. I do worry about places like Pennsylvania, which is trying to implement a universal mail ballot system on the fly. The states that have done this have done it over a period of years. And I think there is some potential for fraud, although it should be easily discovered. Jeff, down there in Harlan County and in my home county of Clinton, I'm sure, it's a tradition among a lot of people to sell their vote. They get an absentee ballot and they sign it and they just hand it over to somebody for a certain amount of money. There's a lot of that small scale fraud that goes on in these local elections. But if you tried to do it in a statewide election or presidential election, it would be easily discovered because you could see the patterns. And that's why there is really no threat through mail balloting to the integrity of this election, except in places where it's a new system that people might try to game or run a kind of fraud that people haven't had experience investigating. That's why I worry about Pennsylvania.
Elisa, you've put a couple of questions in the chat. Do you want to unmute and just ask those to Al? I'm sorry, Professor Cross, to you. You're a student.
Hey.
Yes, of course.
Oh, yeah, that's the name of the song.
Okay, my question is, for those of us whose primary goal is to stop mis and disinformation, what strategies of distribution beyond publishing might we consider?
Strategies beyond, give me the last part of your question.
I said, what strategies of distribution beyond publishing might we consider?
Okay, which strategies of distribution beyond publishing? Well, any form of distribution is technically publishing. But if you're sharing stuff on social media, my first advice to people is read it before you share it. There's millions of things that get shared that people look at after they shared them and then, oh my God, I shouldn't have shared that. But, you know, the 280 characters looks good, and people share it. And, you know, their short attention span is at work. So that's one piece of advice. Read it before you share it. In terms of other kinds of distribution, you know, I think it's important for people to maintain the virtue of word of mouth. Word of mouth, trust in personal communication is still you know, it's essential to our functioning as human beings. And we do too much of it electronically these days. And I suspect that the nature of it is being changed. Nancy might have a better idea about that because that's more in her line of work. But I worry that people are too easily communicating with each other online and not really having conversations in the old-fashioned way. And they need to understand the value of that.
LSA, do you want to ask the second part of your question?
Yes, please. Also, thank you for that first response. My second question is, as a regular citizen, how does one verify the falsehood in information that is displayed in the media today?
Well, there are some good sources. I did a program for the National Newspaper Association convention last week about misinformation and disinformation. And I talked with them about 4 main sources that you can use to check the facts. There is the fact checker column in the Washington Post, which I wish was a little more frequent than it is, but when they do the job, they do a good one. Glenn Kessler is a native of Cincinnati. His mother used to live in Lexington, and he's a first-class guy, first-class journalist, and you can rely on the fact checker. There's an outfit called factcheck.org at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, founded by Brooks Jackson, former reporter for the Wall Street Journal and CNN. He started factcheck.org and still writes for it as editor emeritus. They really do a deep dive into questions of fact, you know, assertions by public figures and so on. It's the most comprehensive fact check that you can get. Then there is PolitiFact, which is published by the Poynter Institute, formerly by the Tampa Bay Times or the St. Petersburg Times, which the Institute owns. It won a Pulitzer Prize in 2009 for its coverage of the 2008 presidential election. Now, it has one feature that I don't particularly like. It categorizes statements as being true, mostly true, half true, mostly false, false, or pants on fire. And those are entertaining categories that has helped make that site successful. But in my years as a political reporter, I spent over a decade analyzing political ads. And I would not have enjoyed having to categorize those. There's always shades that you have to apply, and I don't want to pigeonhole them. That being said, PolitiFact has a really good network around the country. They have partners in several states. They will run material on their site from those states, and they're probably the most active outfit nationwide in fact checking. And then you have Snopes.com, which was founded in 1994 to debunk urban legends, but it has become a fairly reliable checker of fact. And factcheck.org has even cited Snopes in some of its fact checks. So there's 4 places you can go to get the facts.
Okay.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful.
You're welcome.
Dr. Engstrom, I think your question has just been asked or answered, but why don't you ask another one?
I'm going to segue. That's terrific to get the facts. Let's say you don't have a whole lot of money, but you want to subscribe to a newspaper. So besides your local newspaper, what are some recommendations you can give to the young people and the older people here of where to put your money if you've got it to subscribe and not just like click on and then forget about it when you get the
Right.
firewall?
Well, most newspapers offer trial subscriptions, you know, very cheap rates. They're looking for anybody they can to subscribe. And I would take advantage of those trial subscriptions. You know, you might try one newspaper for a month, another one for a couple of months, 3 months. You can probably get a pretty good diet of information for a whole year with short trial subscriptions to newspapers. And you will be able to, after those trials, figure out which newspaper suits your needs and wants the best. And believe it or not, some newspapers will actually cut you a deal. You can call them up and say, I don't want to pay $125 for that. I can only pay $75. Most of them will sell you that. They don't advertise that, but you know, they are hungry for subscribers. I'm going to look for something just a moment.
At some point, Al is going to have to go edit the press conference, the information he puts out on the governor's press conference every day. But we've got about 10 more minutes. If you guys have questions or
got a little more time than that, I think. But I was trying to find my handy bumper stickers, which say, support democracy, subscribe. Newspapers are servants of democracy. They've got to have support from subscribers, from the audience, in order to survive. So in subscribing to a newspaper, you support democracy.
Catherine, did you have a question?
I did. This just blows my mind, and but the recent court case where I guess basically they tried to sue Fox News, Sean Hannity, and the court basically ruled that everyone knows that Hannity is purely for entertainment and should not be taken as fact. So how do we deal with, you know, the law, the court ruling that media outlets are purely entertainment, and how do we combat that?
Well, we really can't. In a country that has a First Amendment and it really is founded on freedom of expression, I think a lot of us would be uncomfortable with too much control. I think the solution is to keep reminding people that guys like Hannity are just out to entertain you, and that they're in league with the politicians. And when a media person is in league with a politician, the word for that is propaganda. That is a word we don't use enough in this country. There's a lot of propaganda out there, and it needs to be called for what it is.
We've talked a lot about the national political scene, Al. What about information about our statewide and then even more locally, our local elections? How do we find good information about that? And then, I mean, is there misinformation and disinformation going on at that level as well?
Well, there's plenty of misinformation when it comes to the TV commercials, which should generally be ignored, but unfortunately have an impact. They wouldn't be spending all that money if they didn't have some impact. It's largely a war of attrition with the McConnell-McGrath race, for example. Each side has about the same amount of money, and they're both misleading about the other. I do think that the Herald Leader and the Courier-Journal, despite their reduced staffs, are doing a fairly decent job of presenting the facts about these candidates and the issues. They are not doing them in the same way that I did when I was a political writer, but you know, there were more robust organizations back then. Now people are having to do it with chewing gum and baling wire, and they do a pretty good job considering the limited resources that they had. Now, I was very glad to see the Herald Leader, for example, put John Cheves onto the congressional race between Josh Hicks and Andy Barr. John Cheves knows how to sink his teeth into an ankle and keep it there. And he will make sure that the people in the 6th district know what they need to know about Andy Barr and Josh Hicks, who are running, I think, a fairly entertaining commercial campaign. It insults the intelligence in some ways, but I think those ads do tell you something about what kind of people they are. Andy Barr is a trust fund baby, and Josh Hicks is a country guy who used to strip tobacco. Those backgrounds are pretty important. Yeah, they're Democrat and they're Republican, and their issue positions are fairly predictable. But in a political race, you can't anticipate every issue. And that's why the character of the candidate is always important to get at. It's sometimes a difficult thing for political reporters, but I tell my students when they're writing profiles of candidates for the Midway City Council, as they are this week, that the number one thing you look for is character. We want to tell people who these candidates are. And yes, we have 7 questions we're asking them about various issues, but the most important thing is character, because you can't anticipate the issues. And then we also look for contrast. If a candidate stands out with issue positions, that's news. And if there's conflict between candidates or other elected officials, then we'll write about that too. Now, that's the 3 C's that I try to teach students: character, contrast, and maybe conflict.
So Taylor, do you remember those 3 C's from your class when you?
Well, it was funny. After I took the rural journalism class, and for years after, when we would be in Midway, my husband thought that I knew an inordinate amount of information about Midway City Council and the mayor and the workings of Midway. But my question is kind of a follow-up on yours, Dean Greer, is how does it change, for example, the London paper, which is now combined with the Corbin paper, with mail-in ballots? The election season in terms of voting is so much longer. And normally, the local paper will put the sample ballot in and the profiles and candidate stances a week, maybe 2 weeks before election day. But a lot of people I know have already cast their ballots. So how does that change the equation for local coverage?
Well, it's been a challenge. As the Secretary of State said today, we're not having an election day. We're having 19 election days for early voting, and absentee voting began even before that. I've have had my absentee ballot sitting here for 2 weeks. Still haven't filled it out because I'm voting in the Frankfort City race, and I haven't decided how I'm going to vote there. The Herald Leader ran the profiles of Hicks and Barr this week, which was a month before the election, almost a month, 4 weeks. And that's early. Usually you'll run those profiles a couple of weeks out. And I think they ran them earlier because they knew that more people were going to be voting early. We're going to put out our print edition of the Midway Messenger early because the very same reason. Early voting begins Tuesday, October 13th. And I'm hoping to get the profiles published of the candidates by the 15th or 16th. We may not get the print edition out by then, but yes, it's advanced the schedule. And it probably means that voters aren't going to be quite as informed. But if there are voters who are uncertain about who to vote for, then they can wait for the paper to do a profile and find out more about the candidate. They don't have to fill out those ballots right now. And I think that we're probably not going to have a problem with mail delivery of ballots in this state because we don't have that many highly urbanized areas. And, the ballots are largely going to be within individual counties. Now, in Eastern Kentucky, there are a lot of registered voters who don't live in Eastern Kentucky. There's, if you look at the voter registration list for the congressional districts, the 5th district has a lot more registered voters than it ought to have. That's because a lot of people who have moved to Lexington or Cincinnati or Louisville or Dayton or wherever have remained registered to vote in Floyd County or Harlan County or wherever. because they may own a piece of property. They may, still they get some kind of utility bill. Their residence isn't really checked. That is an interesting phenomenon that is more of a tangent than the question you asked, but I think it's something for people in those areas to think about in terms of who wins elections and why.
Jeff?
Al, what are the history books going to say about the journalists who've covered the great pandemic?
Well, that's a really good question. The people doing the best work are at outfits like the New York Times and STAT, which is the medicine and science publication of the Boston Globe. The managing editor of that, by the way, is Gideon Gill, who used to be the regional editor of the Courier Journal. He's originally from Boston and went back home to do that job. And his boss is Rick Burke, who covered politics for the New York Times back when I was covering politics for the Courier Journal. Helen Branswell of STAT has done a great job covering the coronavirus. And I always point people to her as a great example of coverage. Don McNeil, I think, is the science guy at the Times. He's done a really good job. And I'm trying to think of some TV folks who've done well on that, but none come to mind immediately. I think the best evaluation of the job that journalists have done covering the virus and the pandemic will come from people who go back and analyze television news coverage. Because unfortunately, most people get their information from television. And this college has a great resource that monitors network and cable broadcasts. Maybe somebody will come along and use that database to check for patterns of coverage and misinformation, disinformation, mistaken information. You know, the challenge of covering this pandemic is sort of like the challenge that public health people had. They don't know everything they need to know about this virus yet. We have learned a great deal in 7 or 8 months, but we are still learning things. And only recently did the CDC change its advice on the website to tell people, hey, this virus is airborne. Well, according to Bob Woodward, Donald Trump was told that back in late February. Why didn't it get to the CDC website until now? Well, I think you can take a guess. It's covering stuff like that that has made covering the pandemic hard. But we've never had a politicized pandemic before, and that has complicated it. The closest thing we had was the swine flu business back in 1976. Most of you on this call are probably too young to remember that, but it was supposed to be a great threat, and Gerald Ford, who was president, perhaps overreacted to it, and there was some feeling that his administration had mismanaged it. But it was never really politicized. People still trusted people in public health. And now you have people in the White House calling people in public health part of the deep state, for God's sakes. It's ridiculous. And I wrote my 3rd column on this subject for the Courier Journal and other newspapers just this morning because I think it's killing people. The politicization of this pandemic is killing people. And unless we have proper political leadership to grab a hold of this wagon, we're going to roll right into the ditch, and the economy is going to go in a tailspin again. You know, all we can do is hope for the best and say a prayer.
What do you make of a situation like we had the last week has just been insane coming out of Washington, but you know, that as you say, you like to keep a balanced Facebook where you've got people on the left and the right, and but the complete lack, or the conspiracy theories that came out after Trump said he was going to the Walter Reed, where you've got people on the left saying it's not true, he's not sick, this is all made up. Then you have people on the right saying, you know, somebody gave him this virus, this was a plant. So all of these conspiracy theories, we can't even agree that our president is sick as a country. So, I mean, how do we get through that? How do we get past things like that, Al?
Well, yeah, there are people on the far left and far right who think that, but you know, those ridiculous voices get amplified on social media. I think that surely the great majority of people in the country really believe that Donald Trump got the virus, and the question is his treatment and is the virus affecting his mentality at this point? That is a rather serious question that we're not really getting an answer to. You know, whoever heard of President making doctors sign non-disclosure agreements and then refusing to be treated by doctors who didn't sign them? That's outrageous. You know, we've known for decades that we needed to know more about the health of our presidents. And, you know, here's a guy with the nuclear codes who may not be in his right mind. I worry about it. I'm going to share a screen just to talk about how people react to these things. This was the last Facebook post that I did. The chart is from Kentucky Health News, and it was the day that the president was revealed to have the virus. So I expressed what I thought was a fairly moderate, even-handed view. Let's hope the president gets better and his COVID-19 case will make Kentuckians take the pandemic more seriously. You know, the governor has said, and I believe that if Trump had taken it more seriously and worn a mask, more Kentuckians will be wearing a mask. He's popular in the state. Well, if you, those of you who follow my Facebook page know that one of my friends said, that's the most condescending thing I ever saw you say. And I thought about that and thought, well, to some people, it probably did seem condescending because I try to speak with a voice of authority based on what public health has to say. You know, public health has always been one of the gold standards, in my mind, for public service. But it exists at the intersection of science and politics. And right now we have a 3-car pileup at the intersection. It's a mess. And my latest column quotes from a former CDC director who says this is the worst failure in public health history. This is from the guy who helped eradicate smallpox. The fact that people cannot accept the truth, cannot accept the facts about the pandemic is really discouraging. And it shows the power of the bully pulpit of the presidency and influence of his media allies, people like Mr. Hannity.
So what was the, you've got 125 comments here, Al. What was the, I mean, was it all across the board of what you got, or?
Oh, yeah. I got the liberals and conservatives just throwing it back and forth. One interesting phenomenon to me is that conservatives have adopted Trump as one of their own when he was never a conservative. He was pro-choice on abortion 5 years ago, or well, maybe 7 years ago. But he's managed to take control of one of the nation's 2 political parties and have it, you know, he has redefined that party. And as somebody who was a registered Republican for most of my life, because I grew up in Clinton County and thought a lot of John Sherman Cooper, it's really discouraging. I wish we had a few more John Sherman Cooper Republicans out there. And if you don't know who John Sherman Cooper is, I encourage you to look him up.
I think we've got time for one more question. add Al Cross to the list of trustworthy sources.
Well, nobody is infallible. When I was a reporter at the Courier Journal, I actually made more than my share of errors because I thought I knew stuff when I didn't. And in the academy, I'm more careful because I'm teaching students. But I still make mistakes, and everybody ought to realize that everybody does that, and everybody needs an editor.
Well, and the key is when you make a mistake, you correct it, and you correct it publicly, and you move on. I mean, that's
Yeah.
rule one in journalism, right?
And that's the last point I would like to make about journalism. And I made this point at newspaper association conventions around the country, and people said they kind of liked it. So it might be something to put in your kit bag to use on people. I got in this business when I was 11 years old. I was a scorekeeper for the Albany and Babe Ruth League, the Albany and Babe Ruth Little League. And the side job for scorekeeping was to write up the games for the newspapers. That's how I got my first byline when I was 11. Well, I was calling hits and errors on boys who were 3 years older than me. And they were not used to the kind of scoring that I was applying. You know, I took my cues from Major League scorekeeping. And, everybody likes, except the fielder, except the pitcher, everybody likes something to be called a hit. If you call it an error, it looks bad for the fielder and it hurts the batter's batting average. The only thing it does is help the pitcher's earned run average. So I got some feedback from some of these older boys who were unhappy, and I mentioned that to one of the coaches, and he said, "You just call them like you see them." And that was a great lesson in journalism. You got to call it like you see it, report the facts as you see them. And I used a baseball analogy to talk about mistakes in journalism. The fielding average of major league players is about 975. 97.5% of the time, a batted ball results in a put out, an assist, and no error. But even the best fielders make errors. So what the critics of mainstream journalism have done is take that 2.5% and inflate them to represent the 97.5, when in fact, almost all of those errors were caught and corrected immediately. And that's something that people need to be reminded of when they complain about the accuracy of journalism. Now, that does not address the point about being selective with your facts, being biased ideologically and choosing not to include one set of facts or the other. And my argument to that has always been the best newsrooms are well edited, and they make sure that doesn't happen. People see reporters standing up in front of a camera telling a story, and they think, well, that's that reporter's idea, and it's all the reporter's doing. And we all know that's not the case. There's an assignment editor, there's a producer, there's a floor director, all kinds of people enter into that story. Journalism is a collective enterprise, and that wrings out most of the bias and most of the errors. Unfortunately, because so many newsrooms have been flattened these days, stories get less editing, and there are more mistakes in the paper. And that's just something we have had to live with in order to have newsrooms with any kind of ability to report the news. Newspapers decided they were going to fire copy editors and keep reporters. I think that it makes it all the more important for them to be careful about the facts that they report. And I think especially to separate fact from opinion, which I think a lot of newspapers do a bad job of these days.
And so I'm going to give the last question to the future of our profession. Elize, you've got the floor for the last question.
Hey there, thank you so much. My final question is, as a journalism major here at the University of Kentucky, with everything that you've brought up today, what is the most important thing that you think that we should take away from this meeting?
I'm not going to write my own headline. You can write that. I hope I've been helpful.
But Al, the copy editors are gone. Who's going to write the headlines? So,
Well,
as I
actually,
know very
I
well,
had
my
some-
husband was a copy editor, and there's not really job market for them. So that's why he works in PR now.
I actually have started writing the headlines for my columns because I complained publicly about the headlines that some of the editors wrote. And they said, all right, you're so smart, write your own headline. So now I do that. But as far as what I've said today, I think consider the source. That old slogan is one you can hang on to.
Wow, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Good luck to you.
Thank you, you too.
And hopefully those students that are on this call will have the benefit of being in Professor Cross's class. And I know Taylor can vouch to how great that class was. So Al, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know you've got to go continue fighting the good fight, getting the next story out from your service, but we certainly appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Glad to do it anytime, and just fight for the facts.
Okay. Okay. Take care, guys. Have a good evening.